your questions. So we're very lucky to have Dr. Greg Jones as our first speaker. He is very knowledgeable on climate and viticulture, and he is the director of the Evanstead Center for Wine Education and a professor and research climatologist at Linfield University in Oregon. So thank you very much, Greg, for participating. And with that, you have the floor, and let's hear from Greg.
Okay, thank you very much, Keith. I really appreciate it. First of all, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to sharing my screen, and I just need to confirm that as well. Can everybody see the screen with an opening slide?
Yes, you're all good.
Thank you very much. So Keith, I really appreciate it. Everybody else that has been involved with putting this event together. It's a pleasure to speak with you today. As Keith said, I'm going to be talking about a very broad kind of general look at this issue from research that I've been doing since the late 1980s, early 1990s, and when I did my PhD in Bordeaux. I've been collecting data and looking at climate, viticulture, and wine for these many years, and I'm going to share with you some very general things that we've been finding and understanding out there. So the first piece, just my outline real quick. We're going to talk about very general climate, viticulture, and wine production connections, talk about some observed changes in climate that we're seeing out there, what future climate change potential has on this industry, and then summarize all that and talk a little bit about some adaptive potential. And much of this, I think, is really going to come out in the other sessions that you're going to have later today and tomorrow as well. So from a big picture perspective, I think everybody on this webinar here understands this, but I'm going to go through this a little here. First of all, weather and climate really presents some very distinct spatial and temporal scales of influences to viticulture, and also, of course, risks. Individual weather events that tend to be short-term and localized are very important. Climate variability that's seasonal, decadal, and regionalized is very important. And then climate change and structure, long-term, regional to global kind of frameworks behind how the climate is suitable to individual crops, especially viticulture, is very important. So when we look at this as a perspective from a climate scientist and even from growers within the business, we see these as crop risk, production and quality variability factors, and then also this broader long-term suitability. So I'm going to talk about a lot of these from a very meta-analysis kind of perspective, but I'm going to start off talking about the suitability framework, something I've done quite a bit of. I drew this diagram on the back of a cocktail napkin in a bar in an airport back in early 1990, and it was the basis of kind of my PhD, looking at climate metrics and different wine production and quality metrics, trying to figure out kind of what do we know and what do we not know about this whole relationship. We know that the relationships are typically parabolic, that somewhere along the way there's too cold of a threshold where you just can't ripen the fruit. Your sugar levels are too low, you get unbalanced fruit. We also know somewhere along the way there's too warm of a threshold where you have lower retention of acids, you typically get overripe flavors, and again, you're unbalanced overall. So somewhere in this middle optimum zone is that Goldilocks, the thing that we all look for to have very consistent ripening. You get good flavors, you get typicity from a given variety. We know that there's vintage variations that drive some factors in there in terms of individual risk, but this idea of this optimum zone is what I've been really trying to look at. So this idea that we have these thresholds, can we understand them? And in doing so, one of the things I think is really important, how much plasticity or adaptive potential do we have within the system in the face of climate change from a management perspective that may be short-term, or a varietal perspective that could be much more long-term. So to give you some factors associated with this diagram is something I've collected data from just hundreds and hundreds of places that grow these varieties, trying to put these thresholds on them in terms of just their growing season average temperatures. For those that use growing degree days, this growing season average temperature is correlated at 0.99 or more worldwide to GDD. It's easier to calculate, and it's a simple temperature value. And you can see the bands here in terms of these optimum kind of thresholds that we find out there worldwide. For all varieties, we know that there are some a range of temperatures that they can grow in. So there's stylistic differences that can be found across those ranges from whether a variety is grown in a cool versus a warm climate. In a cool climate, a variety like Tempranillo could produce lighter body, lower alcohol, higher acidity, and brighter fruit. Warmer zones can produce fuller body, higher alcohol, softer acidity, and darker fruit. So I think everybody understands this. This makes a whole lot of sense. We know that varieties can be grown outside these bounds, but they're typically not going to produce economically and or quality that will be worthwhile to the grower. We can talk about Pinot Noir. It's just a good example. It's also the #1 variety up here where I live, but it has one of the more narrow climate niches in this grouping of varieties for quality production. From what we know about today's Pinot Noir regions, growing season average temperatures tend to be 57 to about 61 degrees. Therefore, it has about a 4 degree Fahrenheit climate niche. We know that it can grow outside those bounds, but not in a very high quality and typicity kind of framework. Burgundy is a great example. The vertical line here is the 50-year average climate for Burgundy, and the horizontal bar with arrows there is the 1.5 standard deviation of that climate over the past 50 years. And you can see during the coolest of years, Pinot Noir can ripen, but it's a lighter style. In the warmer years, it tends to get a little bit bolder and a little bit different in style. So that's just one perspective. And we can also put some quasi bookends on this here. The Tamar Valley of Tasmania is one of the coolest Pinot Noir producing areas today. And Russian River Valley and maybe a few other places are one of the warmer areas for Pinot Noir out there today. You can also take this kind of information and look at where these places are. And this is some of the work that I've been doing with this. So just looking at cool climate viticulture for cool climate varieties, averaging 55 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit, we can take a look at that and then talk about how climate changes will shift some of this information. So when you look at this, this is a map. This data is a little bit old. I need to update it, but this is a 50-year prospectus on growing season average temperatures, and it's a split map. So it's a growing season in April through October in the Northern Hemisphere and October through April in the Southern Hemisphere. And I know it's kind of hard to make out some of these things in here, but let's go ahead and drill into, let's say, Europe. Everything in purple are places that in theory would be suitable for cool climate viticulture. And you can see some of the natural places that we know in parts of Germany and Hungary and Austria and northern France and even Galicia. But you also see some places that potentially don't grow grapes. And the whole idea there is that there are other weather risk factors that may limit them. You can also drill into the United States, and again, a similar kind of map. And again, I'm not saying here that grapes, Pinot Noir, or any of those kind of cool climate varieties are being produced across the Dakotas. It's just that that's where the suitable area is if there wasn't other risk factors. And you can see some of the characteristics of this, especially the valleys up in the Okanagan and the ring of the valleys around the Columbia, the Willamette, coastal zones in California, so on and so forth. So now what I want to do is I want to move from this kind of broad perspective, looking at kind of general suitability, and talk about a meta-analysis looking at a cycle of vine growth, going from harvest in one year over winter through bud break, flowering, veraison, and harvest to the next year. These are the types of changes that have been seen worldwide. Number one, warmer dormant periods have been seen virtually everywhere. This has tended to reduce chilling and cold hardiness. And even though grapevines don't need the same amount of chilling that some horticultural crops do, it still is a requirement to have very even bud break and flowering later on in the year. But the issue here is that winter freezes do not go away in a warmer world. They still occur, they just occur with a different frequency. And I think in some ways, the plant system and the human system are less prepared for them. We also get to the spring period. We clearly have seen warmer air temperatures, but we've also seen warmer soil temperatures. And given the fact that I'm talking to a group of people that do a lot of soil work, I'm going to challenge everybody out there to get temperature probes in the soil everywhere you have a weather station. The reason is that you can model bud break and model certain aspects of spring growth if you have soil temperature in addition to air temperature. Very much important, but again, we've seen places that we do have data. We've seen warmer soil temperatures, warmer air temperatures, and earlier growth in the year. But again, frosts still occur. So we still have a risk there. It's just, it occurs with a different frequency. As we move a little further into spring, we've had some evidence of shifts in rainfall and cloud cover that has impacted flowering and berry set in some regions, but it's a little bit inconsistent overall. It's just that there are some evidence of that. If we move further into the summer, we know that the core area of the growing season has actually gotten longer pretty much everywhere worldwide. We know that there's higher heat accumulation, but we also know that there's higher temperature variability. The within season standard deviation of temperatures from week to week has actually gone up in many places worldwide. And there's also been more heat stress, a change in heat stress events in terms of both of their severity and duration in many regions. When we move over toward harvest, I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but what we're seeing is lower diurnal temperature ranges because minimum temperatures are going up a little bit faster than maximum temperatures in many areas. So the diurnal temperature range, which really helps for preserving flavors and aromas in many varieties as they ripen, is just changed quite a bit. We also know that typically warmer regions are causing fruit to ripen too early. We tend to be very sugar ripe, we lose a lot of acid, and we tend to not have flavor and aroma in sync. So this idea of ripeness clocks being out of sync is something that we have to manage as we're growing grapes for wine production today. Again, I don't have a lot of time to go through this, but just to give you a kind of a meta look at it, all of the data that I've worked with, and I've worked with hundreds of varieties in dozens of regions, we've seen on average about a 4 to 8 day earlier occurrence per degree Fahrenheit of warming. We've also seen that the phases have become compressed, where some are changing more rapidly than others. And so the framework behind that is it just is more rapid within the plant system within a general growth cycle. This is the thing, I can't talk about all of these, but I know from the agenda for the rest of this meeting that these things will be discussed. There are clear changes in soil fertility, salinity, and erosion happening in different ways in different places, whether it be in Australia or Chile or Argentina or parts of Southern Europe. All places are seeing some kind of impact here. We also have CO2 fertilization, but while we understand kind of what that really means for the plant system, we really haven't done much research in the wine sector to understand what does it mean in a higher CO2 environment for wine. Of course, a lot of what you're going to talk about in this meeting is water availability and timing for irrigation if it's possible. The shifts in this are really important for this industry and all of agribusinesses. And then a whole slew of different issues associated with how disease and or pest timing and severity have changed in different places. Some of it because of climate, but some of it also because we just move things around too freely sometimes. So just to give you a sense of some trends that are out there so that you can get an idea, we did this project a few years ago. It only goes through 2017, but we looked at these 23 locations around the globe, and we're trying to assess kind of how temperature trends were occurring in these locations. And so these were cool climate regions all the way to warm and hot climate regions overall. And if you look at some of the trends, I just threw a few examples in here for Surrey in England, Burgundy, Napa, and Perth. Very different kind of climates overall, but you can see that the trends are just over 2 to just over 3 degrees Fahrenheit. All of these locations, all 23 of them, warm significantly with decadal rates of about 0.22 degrees Fahrenheit. The period of record averages across all 23 regions is 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, remember what a climate niche for a variety like Pinot Noir is. It's only about 4 degrees. So if you're warming by 2.5, it depends on where you are in that 4-degree window. I thought I'd put something here in California. This is California's June through August averaged across all divisions. The trend is roughly about what we've seen in many of the places globally, about 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. And all climate divisions in the map on the right-hand side have warmed during the growing season from about 2 to 3.3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1895. We can also go to precipitation. This is something I'm not going to get in greatly with here, but I think you're going to talk about it more in the conference. But look at these regions that we're looking at, ranging from many places all over the globe. If you look at annual precipitation, it ranges from 8 inches to 48 inches. So what does that tell you about how much rainfall is needed to grow grapes and make good quality wine? It's quite variable. The other interesting piece of this is growing season precipitation also ranges quite a bit, from about 3 inches to 22 inches in general. And if you take the ratio of those two, we find growing season precipitation to annual ranges from about 10% to over 84% in Mendoza, Argentina, where they get most of their rainfall in the summer during thunderstorms. But again, somewhere at about that 45 or so percent rainfall amount is during the growing season is where irrigation becomes much more almost necessary. So in terms of trends, there's very few precipitation trends across this whole set of data here. Lots of interannual variability in most of these regions. And so not quite the same kind of signal that we see in temperature. California, again, 1895 to 2020, and this is annual precipitation. There's really no trend. There is some trends in some seasons and some divisions, but it's not a real clear signal. So I think the bigger thing here is that what kind of drought structures are we either in or not in overall? So climate change for the future, again, I'm not going to get into a lot of great detail into this, but I'm going to go to this diagram right here from Berkeley Earth. And I think what's important here is that if you go from about 1970, 1980, the change in global temperatures has been almost linear. And some people even think that it might even start becoming a little bit more exponential. But the basic framework is if we take that signal from 1980 and go out to mid-century, we're really looking at 2.7 to 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit of warming out to mid-century. And this is a global kind of perspective, but you can see that there would be some variation from place to place. We can go back and look at this diagram again, a split map looking at places that are now too warm, that are in purple, warmer but still maybe suitable for cool climate, or completely new areas. And again, I know it's hard to pick this out, but let's go to Europe real quick. And I hope the colors come through for everybody here. But everything in purple now becomes too warm for cool climate viticulture. And then again, moving into the pink areas, this is why the English industry has gotten better over time, because we've seen this ability to ripen fruit when it couldn't do that not long ago. We can go to the United States, and again, a very latitudinal kind of shift in terms of new areas, a little bit of shift toward the coast, a little bit of shift up in elevation as well. So you can see these changes that are potentially out there. I can also show you some research that we did, and I think this is a really important aspect of this. These regions in Europe, these are 18 regions that we did where we used the random forest model to look at or train up the models to know what the climate, landscape, and soil characteristics were in these regions. And then we said, okay, let's fast forward the climate and see how they change. So everything that you see here, the darker areas are the boundaries, the approved AOC, DOC boundaries in these regions. And all of the little speckled darker spots are actually land cover for vineyards. So if we take this and we train it up for a warming to mid-century, what ends up happening here is that some of these regions find that their boundaries are now probably outside of what traditionally they have been known. I mean, there's a lot of really good examples. If you go down into Portugal, here in the Tejo, Ribatejo, most of that area moves closer toward the coast. Parts of the Douro get scattered all over the place. Areas of La Mancha scatter a little bit. So you can see that the idea is that there are shifts that happen both higher in elevation and typically more northerly in latitudes as well.
Greg,
So,
Greg,
yeah.
you got 10 minutes, okay?
Yeah, I'm doing good. I've just about got it all down pat here.
Great.
So I'm going to shift and just look at some distribution data, and this is for the Willamette Valley, and this is our growing season temperatures. And I apologize, I have degrees Celsius here, but 1.1 degrees Celsius is about 1.85 or so degrees Fahrenheit. And so this is our 1895 to 2018 distribution overall, but I wanted to show you what happened for our climate normal from 1981 to 2010. We were shifted roughly 1 standard deviation to the warmer end. Basically, that whole distribution shifted pretty consistently. If we look at 2020 to 2040 in terms of conservative modeling, we're projected to shift again almost another standard deviation. And if we look at 2040 to 2060, moving up to being close to 3 standard deviations above where we have been historically. The interesting piece of this, and maybe this will come out from others speaking in the next couple of days, but one of the things I find very interesting is 18 of the last 20 years have already been here. So the question is that has our climate ramped up even faster than our modeling efforts are projecting, or are we just seeing a sharp warming now, and maybe it'll come down a little bit and then go back up? It's really a hard call, but I'm concerned that we've already been where we think we might be by mid-century, and that our modeling may need to be relooked at to figure this out. So going back to this suitability, what does a changing climate mean for a given wine region in terms of just what they can do? I'm going to go back to the Willamette Valley. We've already seen significant warming from, if you think about the 1961 to 1990 period, kind of a baseline, this was our climate envelope in the Willamette Valley, meaning from the warmest to the coolest places. That's what our envelope has been. During 81 to 20, this is how it transitioned. During 1991 to 2020, which is our new climate normal, this is what I've estimated it's going to be coming up. But then if you go to mid-century, that's what it's projected to be. So what that means is that if you look at the coolest of places within our region will be those places that are remaining in the understood climate suitability window for Pinot Noir. So it could mean pretty dramatic kind of shifts overall for us thinking about how we're going to be suitable for something different. So from a summary perspective and tying this a little bit back, I've mentioned much of this. The planet is clearly warmer than any time in the past that we've had recorded data, and continued warming is highly likely. Persistence in the climate system tells us that. It just, we don't have much that's going to change things. I haven't talked about this a lot, but I think this is huge. The oceans are absorbing much of the heat, disrupting biogeochemistry cycling and a lot of the feedbacks that we have with climate. As evidence, the North Pacific has been much warmer than normal over the past 5 to 10 years. Climate variability has also increased. I didn't show a lot of this, but we've had much more record extremes, but on both ends really, but much more on the warmer extreme side. And there's been increased severity and frequency in some aspects of the climate. Models project continuing increases in variability on top of warming. So we really have an added risk factor on top of average changes in climate. So just some summary here. If I did a little meta-analysis, we've seen roughly about a 1.5 to 3.8 degrees Fahrenheit of warming in the last 50 to 100 years in wine regions. Precipitation trends are highly variable, as I mentioned earlier. Grapevines have responded. They're showing us that the climate is warmer. Phenological characteristics typically have accelerated and changed. We've also looked at some of the modeling efforts that are going on worldwide. And there's roughly somewhere between 2 and 6 degrees warming projected in wine regions. Conservative estimates tend to put that at about 2.5 to 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit, being highly likely. And again, going back to this issue, however, during the last 15 to 20 years, we've already seen conditions that were expected to be more like on average by 2020. So what does that really mean? Some challenges are out there, and I think this will be discussed overall in this conference in the next day and a half here. Changes in vine growth and productivity are clearly out there. We've seen this. Changes in heat and drought stress. Matter of fact, modeling in California says that heat events are 2.5 times more likely in the future than they are today. And the swings between really dry versus really wet periods are likely to be more frequent as well. Changes in pest and disease occurrence and severity is clearly happening. Changes in ripening characteristics have been observed and documented pretty much everywhere, which forces us to really think about what wine styles can we produce. Water resource issues, big one, and I know this will come out over the next day and a half here. Water resource issues are going to be a real challenge in the West, especially. Most large wine regions in the world today are in dry summer climates that depend upon winter snowpacks, and we're going to be challenged, I think, in that arena. Long-term varietal suitability is clearly an issue, and I think we're going to see more of that. And I think one of our biggest issues is trying to understand how to increase adaptive capacity while reducing vulnerability. And I'm going to give you a summary of the things that I have seen in research and other regions in terms of what this industry is trying to do. Number one, we need to utilize the wealth of cultivar diversity in Vitis vinifera. We grow roughly 20 of some 5,000 different varieties. And I think we're missing the boat in really understanding what might be very suitable and good fruit and therefore wines. The problem is there's a marketing issue. I know you're going to talk about that as well. As such, we also need to realize the genetic potential for adaptation as well. We have large landscape potential also. And I think people are starting to realize this more and more as we plant new areas or replant old areas. Again, a big conversation, I know Keith mentioned this, and I know you're going to talk about it, is developing regenerative agricultural approaches, being much better stewards of our landscapes, our soils, and our biodiversity within and around vineyards is going to be very, very important. Optimization of training systems, whether it be the canopy geometry, orienting rows and new vineyards, or even using shading materials. A lot of this kind of work is going on in many regions, and we need to do more of it. This is something I think is worth mentioning here, especially as we talk over the next day and a half about soils. I think we need to really better understand the right combination between the scion and rootstock that we're planting in a given region, soil, and climate. I think we know quite a bit, but boy, I think there's a lot to learn here that would be very beneficial for us in the future. And then lastly, understanding water use efficiency and how to manage irrigation where we have it or where it's possible. I think these are all kind of very big things that we need to definitely learn more about and be able to do to produce a more sustainable wine sector. So with that, I think I'm kind of almost right on time. I did want to mention one more thing here. Up in the upper right-hand side, there's a link there for monthly weather and climate reports. I've been writing these for about 20 years, and it's just something I do. It keeps me totally on top of what's happening. It's very much a West Coast perspective, California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, trying to document what's happened both in the current month or current season, but also look at short-term forecasts. So if you're interested in that, you can go to that link and sign up, and you'll get put on my my email blast for that. So with that, I want to thank you very much, and happy to take questions either now or later, however you guys want to manage it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. That was an excellent presentation and very succinct. And there is a lot there to think about and absorb, but a lot of practical information. So I want to remind folks to put your question and answer. We have a nice chunk of time here. We got 15 minutes to do question and answer. Put that in the, if you look at the bottom of your screen on the far right bottom, there's a Q&A tab. Please start entering your questions there and do not put them in the chat. They won't get answered if you put them there. But yes, thank you very much. That really set the stage for what we're talking about today and from a viticultural perspective. With that, we're going to have Katie Brantley, who is with the Mendocino RCD, lead the question and answer session. And take it away, Katie. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Keith. And we have quite a few questions already rolling in. I'll start out with one that's asking, are growers already planting different types of grapes that are more suitable to warmer climates in preparation for this continued warming trend and looking ahead to the future?
Well, I'm going to go back to Bordeaux real quick. I think everybody, if you've seen the news in the past couple of years, Bordeaux has been working toward approving new varieties for that region. And you know, in Europe, everything is pretty well controlled in terms of what can be grown where and how. But I go back to a talk I gave in 1994 in Bordeaux. I told them that they needed to be doing this, or at least thinking about it. And it took 25 years to do it. It's not that I want to be right or wrong in this whole game. It's just that, you know, it takes time for people to, especially in places where there's a very identity-driven kind of issue with varieties. But I think in the rest of the world, New World, we actually have seen a lot of people experiment more. And I think it's really important that why plant all one variety in your vineyard when you can plant a small test plot so you know what other varieties can perform. I think it's a natural thing to do. So people are doing it. It's happening slowly. Here in the Willamette, we have definitely seen more varieties being tried up here that historically could have never grown here 25, 50 years ago.
Great, thanks. Okay, next one. So your Willamette Climate overall varietal slide was very interesting to folks. They're wondering if you have something similar or have at least some information to share with us today about Sonoma and Napa County regions. I would say any of the North Coast, California.
I don't have it in this current slide deck, but you know, it's pretty easy thing to do. If you take that varietal framework and you calculate out the climate envelope for Sonoma and Napa, you can map that out. Of course, Napa is a little bit on the warmer end. It typically has a wider climate range, but covering a large collection of the warmer end of some of those varieties. I've given that talk somewhere before, and maybe when I put together a PDF of this to share, I'll put it at the end of that so you guys can see it.
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question that's, I'm curious what your response would be to this, but they're wondering if you have results that more or less cover horticultural crops that might also be in some of these regions too, and if you're seeing similar trends.
I've done some work with colleagues on a couple of very large projects in Europe, looking at olives and wheat and almonds in terms of broader kind of climate structures, suitability and change in Europe. I haven't done as much here in the United States, but I would imagine that similar kinds of things can be done for olives, for example, in California. I have been talking with individuals in a kind of a worldwide coffee federation that we're looking to try to define what are the climate boundaries for different types of coffee varieties as well. So I could imagine this could be done for other crops in California.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
This hopefully will be a quick question, but this is regarding your variety temperature range table. They're wondering if the average temperatures are 24-hour ranges or daytime, growing season, or annual.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So one of the reasons I used average growing season temperatures is that over the years, I have found how erroneous and problematic growing degree days are. The issues with growing degree days are that it's often confused when you say the term, people don't really understand it. They think it's a temperature. I know people in the industry do, but in general, it's a misunderstood factor. The other thing is that when you calculate growing degree days, if you don't do it correctly or your weather station software is doing something different than you think it is, you can't compare your data to somebody else's data. It's just not very feasible. In the American Journal of Enology and Viticulture, we published a paper in 2010 which defined the Western United States temperature characteristics and all of the problems with growing degree days. So all that being said is that when I started to do this, I tried to go to something that was simple, which was just temperature. So all I'm doing is taking the 214 days in the growing season, and you could actually do the growing season March to September or April through October, and you get roughly the same results. But it's essentially a 24-hour average temperature and then averaged over the 214 days in a growing season.
Thanks. That helps me understand it better too.
Mm-hmm.
Would you expect oceanic and coastal warming to happen at about the same rate as warming inland?
Yeah, I don't. I think our data so far has showed us that on land warming has been a little bit higher than oceans, but it hasn't. It's not dramatically different. I think the challenge with if you look at the west coast of the United States, the warming that we've been seeing, it does a few different things. Number one, a warmer ocean produces more humidity, basically more evaporative potential coming out of the ocean. So that's why nighttime temperatures have a tendency to be just a little bit higher. But it also produces higher disease pressure when we probably don't need it overall. The other thing that happens, and I think this is really important for the area of the North Coast and the Bay Area, is the dynamics between coastal upwelling and colder water along the coast and the day-night cycle of fog. Our modeling is trying to answer some of this, but it's a real complex issue because the fog is the result of the inland areas in California warming. So warm days, you tend to have rising air that helps pull in the fog. But then overnight, the fog backs itself out. And, so the issue comes down to is that what does the interface between the either warmer Pacific, maybe a narrower range of cold water near the coast, and a really warm inland do? Does it make the fog more prevalent or less prevalent, or occur over a narrower area along the coast? Those are all big questions that haven't been answered yet.
Obviously, lots more to study.
Mm-hmm.
Are you seeing trends in overall vineyard lifespan and replanting that's kind of related or parallel to these climatic trends?
Well, that's kind of a hard one to call. I do know that a lot of people are looking at clearly much more holistic regenerative processes within the vineyards, and I think that in and of itself would be what would create a greater lifespan within vineyards. We have a lot of different challenges, whether it be heat and drought stress to pest and disease severity that potentially are putting more pressure on some of the health of vineyards today. But I think an overall holistic approach would be probably the best thing for us to do in the future.
We should get to hear more about that with some of our other speakers too.
Sure. Yeah.
How do these climatic changes impact the soil organic matter in vineyard soils?
Well, you just talking about more rapid recycling of material near the surface. And again, I think that's why regenerative farming is such a better way to go. So we can maintain some of that a little bit better. The wholesale kind of removal of surface vegetation is likely in many ways not the best way to go. And so if we can kind of maintain a more biodiverse kind of set of plants and animals within that continuum, I think we're going to be better off in general.
Great. So you mentioned the importance of monitoring soil temperature as it relates to bud break. Is there a model available to interpret the data collected?
Actually, and again, great question. And I'm going to challenge everybody to get more data on this. There has not been a kind of universal model developed in this framework. The data that I have looked at, and I know other people in parts of Europe and Australia have looked at, there's a connection between the soil temperature and the air temperature that can help understand when bud break occurs. So I just go back to a very simple plant system. Think about daffodils. Daffodils respond to a warming of the soil, but also a little bit of a day length kind of component. And so tying that warming of the soil back to changes in day length and changes in atmospheric temperatures is where I think the soil temperature modeling needs to go for bud break and even for bloom. Because as the soil warms from, let's say, mid-March right about now into, mid-May, I think if we have enough data, we can build those models. But the limited data that I've looked at, it's very promising.
I just follow up on that. Are there ways to share data that in a more timely fashion that might help with building those data sets?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think the scientific community has done a decent job at this, but has probably a lot to learn and grow from on it. I think we need to do a better job of collecting and sharing data across companies and businesses and governmental agencies. I've been working, I know some of you are probably familiar with Fruition Sciences. I've been working with them for the past 5 or 6 years, and I think that there's some really good work going on there to help try to better understand aspects of this and how the plant's responding to both climate and drought stress and other factors. And I think there's a lot of sharing that's happening within that arena. I don't personally have a place I can tell you just to go to share the data, because it really, I think there's some other ways in which we need to develop that system before we can actually make it be universal.
Sure. Well, hopefully we can keep working towards that.
I agree.
Are you seeing any climate change impacts on wine quality?
Well, it depends on what you determine wine quality to be. That's a big open question. How do you measure wine quality? Number one, there really isn't a universal number. I mean, we can take some kind of chemistry from the fruit, from the wine, and put it into perspective. You can also take certain things like, and I know this is opening a can of worms, but vintage ratings, how people have rated wines over time. And I've done a lot of work on this because it's really one of the only measures we have to try to look at this characteristic. And we've developed some modeling that has taken rating systems, not just one like Wine Spectator, but dozens, and puts them all together into what's called a consensus ranking. So we get the consensus of a whole bunch of individuals in terms of quality. And from that, we can really kind of look at some of the factors driving quality. And we've clearly seen some changes, but we've also seen some variability there as well. We've published papers on Burgundy, port wine, Tuscany, and Bordeaux. And at some point in time, I'm going to do something on the North Coast with the same kind of data. But again, it gets back to this issue. We all need to come to and understand what is wine quality, and do we have a better measure of it that we can use? Because that's the kind of things that we need to do from a climate science perspective to be able to analyze. We need really good data defining wine quality.
Makes sense. So getting back to the importance of measuring soil temperature, where and how deep would you recommend doing that?
Well, this varies a little bit. I've seen quite a few different numbers, but most of the time, and I'm going to talk in centimeters because that's what most people have been doing, is 10, 30, and then 1 meter or 100 centimeters. You don't have to do all three, but you should at least do the 30 centimeter value, because I think that's where we've seen the most correlation with plant growth.
I'm going to jump in and let you know we got time for one or two more questions, we wrap up this session at 9:25.
Great. How about, do you think looking at increases or decreases in microbial activity or respiration would be beneficial to track in relation to the grape growing and wine quality?
Yeah, I really do. I mean, I think that's a great question. You really need to be able to track everything somewhat simultaneously. You need to track all that microbial activity, but also track that, in terms of fruit characteristics, and then tying it into how the wine turns out. Many research studies that are done often look at one thing in a compartment and then don't tie it into the other components. And so I think that as science develops projects, we need to be more critical about those projects being holistic, from, let's say, the microbial component all the way to the wine component. It makes projects more difficult, but those are the ones I think where we get the biggest information from.
Great, thanks. I think that's all the time we have. So sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but please reach out to any of us, our CDs, or to Dr. Jones directly to answer some of these additional questions that you might have. Thank you to everyone.
Yes.